All right, now it's recording. It should ask you to allow.
To allow it, yeah, okay. That's what the okay is for. Okay.
Well, as you can see, I've got the sun behind me, casting a haze of glory.
Oh, I thought your halo.
Would that it were. Um, so there may be points where we have to stop because, of course, I'm some discomfort, and so there, it may not. But actually, I kind of like the sun somewhat obscuring the expression on my face just now. It may change in the course of the conversation. I can't remember. We say north, south, east, west. Well, actually, the sun will be moving that way, so it'll probably get worse.
Well, it depends on how quickly the Earth is spinning today.
Yeah, it's a variable, isn't it?
It's one of those days where it seems to be taking its time.
All right. So I've had conversations recorded with some. Okay, I'll ask you not to do that again during the course of this conversation.
And let me do it now and then be ready to edit it out. Sorry about that. Sinuses never sleep. Anyway, yes.
Well, as I was about to say, I've recorded conversations with a great many very distinguished writers and thinkers, and even one Hollywood actor.
Now you're down to me.
I was about to say, I thought it would be a nice change of pace to talk to you.
Okay.
One of my two brothers, the elder, not the eldest, 7 years my senior, Robert Warren Hart, the vicar or rector of. I'm trying to have an international flavor here, so just maybe it's the rector of the parish church of
St. Benedict's Anglican Catholic Church in Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
yes. You're a priest, something of an agitator politically, but long before you were either of those things, you were a musician and performer and a composer, and I thought we might talk a little bit about music, since it is one of the topics of my Substack, and it's in current circumstances, I don't have quite the stamina necessarily to produce my columns on music at the ideal rate. So I thought I could let you burble on for a bit. I've got companions here. This is, well, those who've read The Mystery of the Green Star will recognize Muzzles, I hope. And this is a donkey named Jonathan. As you know, all the characters in those books are based on toys that have a long history with the family. And you're a toy who has a long history with the family as well, in a sense. Before we begin talking, anything you'd like to say up front? Any news to impart? Any words of wisdom? Any appeals or supplications to listeners?
Out of the White House.
Right, I thought that was coming. Do anything you can to keep Donald Trump out of the White House, short of committing sins. That is, don't attempt to stop him.
Right.
The fellow in, yeah, it was Pennsylvania did, but yes, do anything you can within the bounds of morality and legality, fair play, and democratic norms. To prevent the orange menace from oozing back into the White House. I think that's
That's my appeal.
That's a good moral exhortation.
Unfortunately, the people overseas.
Your sound is not constant, and apparently, if you put something in front of your mouth,
Put the mic right there where it's closer. I'm sorry.
I see you're using a Blue Yeti. I used to when I had higher production standards, but right now it's catch as catch can. And what are you doing these days? Composing, improvising, recording. You do record a lot of both your own music and performances of others on YouTube and on your Substack publication, the Musical Platypus, the single most, how can I put it, musicologically sophisticated musical Substack out there. But why explain again why you called it the Musical Platypus?
I call my Substack the Musical Platypus because I, and basically in writing about music, was and discussing music, I would have no interest in sticking to just one genre. If I was doing it maybe 30 years ago, I would be concentrating on almost exclusively on classical music in those days. But that would be because I was a bit of a snob, you know. And then as I thought about it, I realized how silly that was because you know, some of the greatest music ever written is not just classical. It's also in the worlds of rock music and jazz. And that really what I had done when I was younger and I was performing, I was known for basically for what's called fusion. When I was performing in and around Columbia, Maryland in the early 80s, and I actually had my own groupies. I mean, there were people who showed up everywhere I performed. But
Well, there's no accounting for taste, but yeah, it's
but
I think you should explain though, this wasn't a massive public move.
no, it wasn't something you're going to find in. You're not going to find old
It was
things.
4 to 6 rather pale and bedraggled characters who would you know
There were mainly a bunch of people who had heard me perform and where they knew me and they just loved to hear me perform. And I was always doing mostly
let's pause here and let our listeners know that you're not a mad egotist. You're just simply
no,
being.
they liked it, so they showed up. But I say fusion. The piece that they always wanted me to play, and it's on my YouTube channel. I have a recording of it that I did several years ago called the Blue Toccata and Fugue. And it is as it sounds. It is a fugue. It starts with a that's a well, I call it toccata because it's you know it's something that it means it means to touch.
If you
Uh,
send, yeah, if you send me a link to it, I'll include that on Substack at the same time as.
well, in the video I did of that one, I did that a long time ago, like 2010, 12. But when I updated it, I added some imagery to it of some various musical influences that had already affected me when I composed it. And I was only 18. So there'd be more influences if I was putting those pictures in there today. But it was, as it sounds, you know, a classical form, a Baroque form, essentially, toccata and fugue, but it was also both jazz and rock music at the same time. So it was
And
that's
I mean, does the blue there indicate blues chord progression, or is that just
it. There is only really one aspect of it that was really had anything to do with the blues, and that's on a blues scale in the toccata descends very distinctively. Blues scale being the pentatonic scale with the tritone.
right?
Let me explain that. Uh, blues scale. well, we can't see this, but
Well, I mean, to make it very simple for those who, I mean, a pentatonic scale is something that you could play on the black keys of your keyboard only, and
you
it's
could, yes, those 5 notes. It's the
right.
relation between the
That,
same notes.
and that's actually the basic scale of a great deal of Asian music, both East Asian and Southeast and South Asian.
And
And,
it's also the basic music that's in the Celtic
right,
music. I mean, real Celtic music. I don't mean the Irish tenors singing songs written like, and by
1940, yeah.
and written in New York about Irish eyes smiling. I mean, real Celtic music.
Celtic music, yeah. But
So,
in blues, you have the tritone.
and you have in the pentatonic scale is also predominant in parts of Africa. So it's sort of like a universal thing. It shows up all over the world. The difference is it's not really something you find though in India, in Indian music, but it's those 5 notes which are
Well, I think that's not. I think there are a lot of ragas actually. If you look at them, the tone structure, you will find the chords. It is pentatonic, but
it evolved from it obviously evolved from the pentatonic scale.
yeah.
It obviously is somewhere down there deep in the history of that music. But I should let people know what it sounds like, so they know what I'm talking about. Give me just a second. Uh, while this thing
I
kicks.
should say that you were there in your music studio.
Well, yes, that's
And,
essentially it. You can't see it from the camera angle, but
okay,
the
that's
pentatonic scales one. Actually, I better turn that up. There's 1/3.
yeah. Sorry, it's not coming through. It's in fact when you hit it, it blocks out your voice. Do you have it plugged directly into the computer?
Um, that would take some doing. Okay,
But,
I can do
but then for some reason it's not. Maybe it's too loud. Maybe it's just your.
that. Second. I can do that. I hope you're going to edit this a bit so it flows better. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I like the rough and ready, especially the close-ups of your abdomen, which I have to say is larger than,
Okay,
though mine is now much smaller than I recall from a few years ago.
do it. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Now let's see if we can hear the music.
Yeah, it's not going to work. If I plug it into the computer, it won't pick up me talking. It
Yes, I'm
it
just trying to
that's the microphone. So
try to change the angle of the microphone and try again.
yeah, I'll speak separately from these notes.
Alas, it's just not coming through at all. Maybe it's overwhelming the microphone. I don't know.
That's weird. That's very strange. Okay, then I'll forget trying to do that. I'll turn these off and see if this doesn't work, then I guess edit this whole part out. Did that come through?
Well, the first note and then sort of the top tone of the others. So, but nonetheless,
That's strange. It's really strange. All right, well, we'll forget about using the
anyway,
keyboard. Okay.
the
The pen
basically all the flat sharp intervals on the keyboard.
the pentatonic scale is the first, the minor third, the fourth, the fifth, the minor seventh, and of course, that leads us back to the first, an octave higher. When the blues scale adds something called the tritone, that is the half step between the fourth and the fifth.
Right.
That I forget which, but one pope back in the Middle Ages, or maybe the early Renaissance, declared that the tritone, that is that note between the fourth and the fifth, uh, that half step against, the note that we would call the root, um, was the devil's interval. Yeah, I
Well, it's I don't know if it was a papal slander, but yeah, the Diabolus in Musica was uh, how it was known according to the rules of medieval.
It, however, is used in a lot of church music after that.
Yeah,
Uh, because it's an essential part of complex harmony and without it, you can't have a diminished chord. A diminished chord being a minor chord where the fifth is half a step low, in effect, the tritone. So it shows up in sacred music. So when I say a blues scale, it's a
basically,
pentatonic scale with the tritone.
yeah, basically any three adjacent whole tones are going to be a tritone.
Yeah, with a tritone in there that is something that showed up in North America. It's something that was added to the pentatonic scale either during the period of slavery, by the black community that was enslaved and oppressed in this country. It shows up there, and we don't know where it first shows up, but it becomes an important scale later for the development of jazz and then rock and roll, which comes basically from the same community. And as a result, you know, it started. It's with us. It's a very important part of American music, especially in rhythm and blues, and all that wouldn't exist without it. So,
Yeah, well, the truth of the matter is that if we're going to talk about distinctively American music, um, you know, all of it with maybe a few variations of Scots Irish music in the Appalachians. Basically, all of it comes from that sort of anything, out of black music, and the blues scale is, I guess, unique in its origins because again, the pentatonic plus the tritone, and
plus the
it's a simple idea, and yet it's remarkable how affective it is, and what a completely different sound world it can create.
well,
Um,
it does, and it revolutionized music once it started to break out and become heard more and more by people.
so anyway,
Uh,
we've gone.
Other elements, distinctively American music is Scots Irish. That music is essentially, I mean, a lot of what's called bluegrass from way out, in the Appalachians and all that, uh, is really Celtic music. And a lot of the melodies are the same. They just have different words. So that was one of the things that was very interesting. What was that Irish group? My wife has so many of those CDs.
The chieftains.
The Chieftains did I think an album with American bluegrass artists because it was Celtic music. Yeah.
So we've already gone far afield. The point is that early on you were already, I mean, I grew up with you, so I mean, I know that if you weren't a Christian, your religious life would have just been arranged around Bach.
Around what?
Bach,
Bach.
yes,
Bach, especially. I mean, Bach.
yeah,
Jeez.
that's always been your first and deepest love. But I do remember the piece. And it's a toccata, it's a fugue, and it's you know.
It's also jazz and it's also rock. And so,
Yeah. So
first time
let's
I
bring
heard
this
someone
back.
use the word fusion was when they were just explaining to me what I had done, telling me what I had done.
Brings us back to this your totem, the platypus, who represents your musical tastes and interests precisely because he is a fusion, the platypus of things that elsewhere, he's an egg-laying, furry, duck-billed melange of what look like separate evolutionary lines, but that achieve an,
Yes,
an oddly attractive.
I I admire the character, the fortitude, the strength of the platypus to defy being categorized.
That's true. And
I
that's
strive to emulate the great example that the platypus sets and being an individual, even though there's so many of them,
yes, but each of them is
of the species.
yeah. And like you, they're into fusion. Now, the
But
now what was I originally going to talk? Oh, I remember. Even though you could hold forth for several days on Bach and on the Baroque, I thought
well,
we
I can't really do that. Food would run out by tomorrow. No.
true. Um, mm, excuse me. Must adjust myself here to. Um, recently, I'm trying to get back to writing more like myself, Substack, although since I can't touch it, can't lean over a keyboard now without considerable discomfort, I have to dictate things to Patrick, my son, and he's my amanuensis. It's a very different way of writing, one I'm slowly becoming accustomed to. Um, but recently I resumed putting new content on, hoping it will grow deeper and richer and wider, and I can return to form. And one was a Q&A column, and someone asked my opinion of Chopin. And I didn't think this was something one had to, be explicit about. I guess there are those who dislike Chopin, but then there are those who dislike sunlight and love, I guess. I don't know. But of course, to my mind, Chopin is, you know, really the greatest composer of his era, and I'm more of a Wagnerian than you are. I have a greater a greater tolerance for romanticism at its most decadent and excessive, though not Liszt. I have well, some of Liszt, like the Année de Pèlerinage and things like that. But the sort of strident bombast and fireworks of Liszt, I find unbearable sometimes. But the Romantic period did allow the sort of it took the chromaticism of monody and the and in part the new musical technology, so to speak. Like Chopin's composing for the pianoforte. It's capable of dynamic effects that are simply impossible on any kind of clavichord or keyboard instrument of any kind before that, any sort of clavier. But there's also a period of bombast, strenuous emotion, um, you know, vast periods, huge changes in dynamics. But it doesn't it's not a period that values flow in the way that the music of Bach or Scarlatti or Handel does. And then there's Chopin. And this is the thing: is it means he's a romantic composer, but he stands apart. I mean, it's his idiom is so distinctive that you know, you don't just set them next to Berlioz and say they belong to a single movement. There's something, and George Bernard Shaw, I think, said it best when he said that Chopin reminded the world, and Shaw, of course, himself is a creature of the late Romantic period. I mean, he lived in a time when he found it outlandish that someone would perform Bach's unaccompanied violin partitas and sonatas without adding piano accompaniment. He said, it's just our ears can't hear the beauty. No, it just was. But he said of Chopin that he had proved that elegance was still possible to a generation that had forgotten this. He could have all the emotive force, all the affectivity, all of the grandeur of the romantic, and still contain it in forms of exquisite elegance and flow. So that's my take on Chopin. I think, it's a smaller oeuvre, not to use a wicked word. It's a smaller body of work than many composers, but I can't think of a single piece that he produced that falls below the level of genius.
Well, even something as simple as his prelude in C minor that,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly, was that Barry Manilow wrote words to and sung over top of in the 1970s, but it was strictly music of Chopin.
He did.
Even that something simple as that, yes,
What, what song is this? I'm not a Manilow
I'm
aficionado.
sorry, I don't know the name of it.
Well, that does you credit.
Because of the fact that Chopin was the basis of it, I was made aware of it. And uh but I don't remember the name because was playing that prelude and someone thought I was playing the music of Barry Manilow. I said, no, that's Chopin. Uh but
Like when you play, oh, what's the Paul Simon song that he wrote from the St. Matthew Passion? Um, oh gosh, I can't remember. Anyway, go on.
unfortunately names are the first thing to go and
Yeah. Anyway,
right. Okay, here's the thing I'd say about Chopin. Uh
not that I would.
it's important to understand
Paul Simon to Barry Manilow. I want to make clear that I love Paul Simon, but go on.
the development, the evolution of the arts in general is that the thing that really makes something a great art is not personal expression, it's cultural expression. Okay, it's something that for some reason enters into the culture on a level that makes it something worth hearing and worth remembering. And truly great advances in any art form, whether it's music or say painting, when suddenly you had painters like Van Gogh, Monet, Manet, etc., giving us impressionism. It's the camera was better at realism than painting, so some great geniuses did something new with painting and became a cultural expression where it advanced the art of visual art and painting. Well, same thing with music, things advanced it, things made it change. And the invention of instruments was even part of this and the evolution of instruments. So if you had not had the if you had not had Bach and others, but mostly Bach, advancing the tempered tuning that is what the well-tempered clavier is all about. Two books of 24 preludes and fugues in every key, major and minor, chromatically from C all the way up to B. If you had all this was actually a thesis, an argument, but great pieces of music. That had to come first. You had to have the ability to write in any key and have it transpose anywhere it wants to go, move anywhere it wants to go. So tempered tuning, which as I said in my own piece about that in Substack, what makes it what it is it's just wrong enough to be right. It just changes the pitch a little bit on each third so that everything can move together. All the so you could do things. Bach could do things that couldn't have been done with the older modes, even when keys were mostly just a recreation of modes with more complexity. So you have Chopin come along after Bach, after tempered tuning, then after Beethoven pretty much forced us from the world of polite classical music into the Romantic era, almost single-handedly. Beethoven did this, and people started to catch up with his new way of composing. So now along comes Chopin. He's inherited all this. And now there's this brand new instrument, not completely brand new. The fortepiano had been invented in the later part of Bach's life. I forget the name of the Italian man who invented it. And it was used a lot by Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven. But by the time you get to Chopin, you have the modern piano, the piano as we have it today. And let me say something about pianos. Every piano in the modern era has as its standard the Steinway Model D piano. And with almost no exceptions, all of the great concert pianists from the late 19th century right straight through to today, whether they are in America, where the Steinways have always been made by hand, each part, or if they're in Europe for the most part, even though a few might want to use a Bosendorfer or something, the standard piano for the concert stage is the Steinway Model D. And that is that really big one that projects to the back row, that was designed to do that so that you could hear the most quiet notes at a time where microphones did not yet exist. Well, this means, first of all, you have the most amazing dynamic range. And then the keyboard is expanded to 88 keys from what had been the standard 66 keys. And you have, if you have the technique and you can do it, the ability through dynamics that that are not possible in any other single instrument from that time. You have the ability to go from the loudest sound to the most quiet sound. Suddenly he has at his fingertips an instrument that is capable of doing what only could have been done by orchestras. But one man could sit there and do all this just from one single instrument. Before the modern piano, that was not possible. The pianos that were played by Haydn, Mozart, even Beethoven, were very limited in comparison. And they could only be played in a small enough room where you could hear it. You couldn't fill the modern, I mean, a place like Carnegie Hall, forget it. Those days without microphones.
We get the point. We get the point. So move along here.
What's that?
Getting into the weeds here. Yes,
All right.
we
Well,
understand.
the point is Chopin had the modern piano at his fingertips. So he could, with one instrument, write music where the sounds and everything are so full of color and expression And well, the result is this. He gives clear instruction on every detail of how to play his music. And the pieces that I played by Chopin included the prelude I mentioned earlier, a nocturne, the Polonaise in A major called the Military Polonaise, and the waltz in C sharp minor that requires a lot of very fast finger work played very quietly. And that ends with a chromatic burst upward and up to the final note of 3 times, and a bit of it that is repeated 3 times in the waltz. In fact, it's an amazing piece because the entire piece is basically the piano is sighing. The whole piece is sighing.
Trying not to frighten people away from this.
Okay. Well, if you're going to play any great classical music, you do sort of have to sing it to yourself to know how to interpret it. That's why you hear Glenn Gould in his recordings always,
No
they mastered them out. You could hear him humming over top because that's part of how he interpreted it so well. But anyway, getting back to Chopin, he was able to, with the instrument, the piano, he was able to do what could only be done before with an entire orchestra. And other composers of the era did some very interesting things, such as Franz Liszt,
Yeah.
transcribing Beethoven's symphonies.
Which I have to admit, I actually love his transcriptions. I was a bit rude about Liszt earlier, but I do love his trans.
Yes, you were. He was a genius. He's a brilliant composer.
He was,
Uh,
you know,
and Busoni doing Bach's organ works and so forth. But to me, the organ works those were great transcriptions. But what Liszt was able to do was show that the piano could be used to play symphonic works, and it's very interesting. The best recordings, in my opinion, of Liszt's transcription of Beethoven symphonies were by Glenn Gould. And I don't think there was ever a greater pianist than Glenn Gould. Horowitz was great, Rubinstein was very good, and but there was none of them were greater than Glenn Gould, who could play everything from Bach to Wagner to the Sechs Kleine Klavierstücke by Schoenberg, but and make it really interesting. Normally you think of Schoenberg, you're going to be bored, but you listen to him play it and really play it. At any rate, Chopin's pieces, though, are very demanding because there's so much where every note has to be absolutely exactly the correct note, coming at the right time with just the right feeling. Now, with any truly great music, I learned long ago, you have to memorize it. You have to memorize it so well that you're not thinking about it in terms of note by note, but strictly how you're going to interpret it. Your fingers have to know it. Now, that's why I don't find playing Chopin to be any fun at all. I kind of had fun with it at times, but boy, is it a lot of work. It's hard work.
Well, I mean,
if you play Chopin all the time, you're on a vacation.
yeah, you also have a bit of arthritis now in your right hand, right? So it's not going to
On
be.
my right wrist, thank God it's not in my hand. But because of the arthritis in my right wrist, the stretching to play the military polonaise has gotten to be painful. That's just the way things happen as you get older, because you have to have way out more than an octave in both hands at times. And now there's a really difficult piece. Forget trying to, no, I don't think anybody can sight read that piece and play it. You either memorize it and your fingers know it, or you're never going to play it, because he does all these things in the midst of all these complicated chords and chord changes. He throws in double sharps and all these things mixed in with 100,000 other notes that you're all trying to play with just two hands, as chords that are moving along. It's like either I take it Chopin must have had even larger hands than I do. I have large hands, and his must have been humongous to play that stuff. But when you're moving around with the double sharps and all this, forget thinking about it while you're playing. Forget about that, because
Well, now let's
you'd have to have a computer in your head. But so you memorize it, your fingers memorize it, and you strictly concentrate on interpretation. And let me tell you something else about technique here. Most people will never be able to play that music because they haven't learned the secret of how to play and keep your arms and your fingers relaxed.
Yeah.
They're actually exercises, and concert pianists were doing this long before the 20th century. They learned it, and they obviously learned it from the Far East. I believe it has some kind of tag. It comes from yoga, where you have to literally hang your fingers down until they feel tingly. And the way you play those loud chords is not to put more force into it, it's to relax more.
Yeah.
And let the weight of your fingers be released into the keys. There are techniques that if you're not taught how to do this, you will only be able to play that music a little bit before your hands tense up.
Okay.
Let's say tense up, you cannot play those notes.
Right.
And this applies even to the earlier music. So when this technique was learned, it's like this, it seems to come from some kind of thing related to yoga that was learned in Europe to make the arms and the hands and the fingers relax before you play.
Yes, you're getting repetitious here.
Okay.
That's all right. That's all right. You're also getting old and forgetful, so it happens.
Huh? Yeah, I'm listening. Well, now you know what the future holds. It's called senility.
Oh, I'm well beyond that. So let's move on to something else on your Substack. Since it occurred to me, you also happen to have a certain regular recourse to the Beatles, for whom you make what I consider to be totally justified claims regarding their inexplicable musical sophistication, um, by ear, uh, uh, since they did not have that kind of formal musical training or musicological training, and yet, um, and it occurs to me, just for fun, we could shift there for a moment, because as you've often, made the point that even some of the earliest, simplest things they produced were actually quite extraordinary. And I think recently we were talking, and you were telling me how much the early John Lennon song "When I Get Home" is something that you find musically fascinating and impressive, and much more so than, without any denigration intended, but much more so than "Hey Jude," which is a very simple, a simple composition. And course, far better to people who aren't into the deep
In fact, I was reading something recently where someone talked about the greatness of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's right. But like so many people who write these things who aren't musicians, and so I give them leeway. He was talking about the difference between their early songs and the more complicated compositions like Hey Jude. And I thought, well, Hey Jude's a very fine song, but it's one of their most simple songs. It's not at all one of their most complex. And the thing about the Beatles is they would go from doing things utterly ingenious. Sometimes it's, just playing a more simple song, but almost none of them are actually simple. It happens to be, Hey Jude is very rare in that it's simple. Uh, from the start, they were doing things that, well, I think your dog got it right. Roland, may he rest in peace. Fine Christian gentleman that he was, as I remember him. When he said to you that the Beatles were proof of the existence of God. Yeah, they didn't go to a conservatory. And although Paul's father was a musician and Paul had high standards about music, that had to be good music, they just burst out with this creativity. But the pure genius of John Lennon and Paul McCartney as composers, and then George Harrison gets into this as well, is that they wrote these things that sound so standard in terms of their melodies and all this. It sounds so standard that you can whistle it, you can sing it in the shower. It's, the melodies are there in such a way that everyone can, in some way, really enter into that. And yet they're not standard. They are anything but conventional. So you mentioned When I Get Home. When I Get Home opens up with an A major, or well, an A7 chord, which, and the way things are written, that means it's an A major chord with the G natural at the top, the seventh, the minor seventh. So it opens with a major chord, an A major chord, an A7, which is setting you up to go to D. Okay, once you hit that 7 there, that becomes the fifth of the D scale, if you're expecting the key of D to follow, you're expecting a resolution 5/7 to 1 to D. Well, it goes to D. And I'm sure this song was John Lennon. It says Lennon McCartney. Pretty sure this is a John Lennon song.
He's the one singing, so that's how you
Yeah,
know.
he's the one singing the lead, as George Martin points out. That's how you really tell who was the main writer of a song, or sometimes the only writer, since a lot of their songs were not collaborations. But even though both names appear, but yeah, John Lennon's name on Yesterday, he had nothing to do with writing that song. But anyway, When I Get Home, you've got the A7, it goes to D with a chromatic note in there where the melody is now, it's being sung and played in the instruments, and the melody he's singing is going back and forth between E and E flat or D sharp, whichever you want to call it, because it's the same note. I got a whole lot of things to tell her. Okay, so that's in the chord of D. Well, except it's obviously not going to resolve to the D chord because of that. He's playing around with the second. He's going between, well, let's say D and D sharp, as the melody line goes. And then that D then has the seventh in it also, the minor seventh, setting you up to go to to resolve or to go to G. Well, it resolves as A. It it goes to D and it just ends up as A, and then suddenly goes down to a G7 chord. And now the main melody starts in the key of C. And then he keeps buzzing around playing games with a relative minor. So it's so that the A is always there, A the sixth in terms of a how you would count where does relative notes. So C the sixth is A, so the relative minor for C major is A minor. So it's sort of not making up its mind whether it's C major or A minor. So what he does, he lands finally when the song finally resolves, he's really landing it as C major with a sixth. This, which means that how you invert it, if you put that sixth in the root, the chord it all resolves on would be an A minor seventh, but because the C is in the root, it has that distinctive sound, such as the final chord of She Loves You. It has that distinctive sound that we would call, a sixth chord, meaning it's a major chord with a six included. But I mean, the rhythm of it is also fascinating. It is complicated rhythmically. Every time he starts a new verse with "Come on, if you please," or "Come on," he's so far on the offbeat. And John Lennon did this a lot. He would pull you into his songs on the offbeat, and he did this during the time of the Beatles. He did it after the Beatles. The rhythm of John Lennon's music is as complicated, sometimes as interesting as the chord progressions, which in the case of the Beatles, right from the start, right from their earliest songs, their chord progressions are like things that the big band jazz songs contain. One of my most watched videos is I'm playing "Take the A Train" by Billy Strayhorn.
Mhm.
But
Often attributed to Duke Ellington, but yes, Billy.
yeah, it's attributed to Duke Ellington because he did the most famous recording of it, and Billy Strayhorn did in fact compose it for the
Well,
Duke
Billy Strayhorn and
Orchestra.
Duke Ellington were basically, I mean, they really were, you know, they were one musical personality in a sense. Duke Ellington was the one who is better known and ultimately the far more accomplished in terms of
Yeah.
but he was also the public. Billy Strayhorn was a very retiring man, so he's in the band and he's writing, but he didn't like to be out in front, and so
But he
as
wrote their most famous signature.
some of the most famous Duke Ellington pieces are actually Billy Strayhorn. But anyway, yeah, go on.
Well, I mean, okay, the point is the chord progressions and those things were very, very innovative. So you have something like "Take the A Train" where, it's C and then it's a C7, then it's a then it's a D augmented, and no, I'm sorry, it's it's a D major with a diminished fifth, and then a G7, and so these are very colorful and creative chords, unlike anything that if you would look for anything close to that in classical music, it would be Debussy, the music of
Debussy.
Claude Debussy, where the harmonic progressions are now different from what had been standard. Uh, Standard harmonic progressions from the days of the Baroque era right up through the Romantic era. So, well, the thing is, when the Beatles in their earliest songs, there's that big band influence that most people don't seem to notice.
Yeah.
Well, of course, the song where it's the most obvious is "Tell Me Why." "Tell Me Why" is definitely, from A Hard Day's Night.
Yes, I know.
That's big band music, right down to the swinging bass, walking bass line. But the chord progressions of the Beatles were very sophisticated right from the start. Now, we say right from the start, I'm talking about the songs they wrote, the songs they recorded. And we must understand that as we know the Beatles, we sort of know them from 1962 on, but at least John, Paul, and George have been playing together since 1956. So they had learned a lot, and they had learned from black rock and roll artists like Little Richard, who introduced them to rhythm and blues. They had learned from Paul's father, who taught them some jazz, John and Paul. And they grew up listening to what was ever on the radio, everything from classical music to the big band music that was the music of the time that they were born and raised in, because they were all born during World War II. They all knew what it was to have bombs dropped on them as well. But the thing is, somehow right from the start, without what we would think of as formal training, they're doing these things that are so impressive that Leonard Bernstein and Richard Rodgers both congratulated them as great composers when they first arrived in New York for the Ed Sullivan Show. Now you had people who didn't know what they were doing, which cuts both ways. They didn't know what the Beatles were doing, and they didn't know what they themselves were doing, and wrote these stupid critical things, including the always obnoxious William F. Buckley and others who, after 60 some years, we reread the things they said about the Beatles and we're laughing at the critics.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Well,
real musicians, Leonard Bernstein, one of the all-time greats. Richard Rodgers, who wrote a lot of wonderful music, and at that time was still being, mostly acclaimed for The Sound of Music, though he had written so many other things, including Lady is Tramp, for Frank Sinatra's song, and Ella Fitzgerald, both in very different ways. But you have people here, are real composers saying, hey, these guys are great. And in England in 1963, they had won the Composers of the Year award in Great Britain, and that was for a song called which song was it? This is terrible. I know it. It Won't Be Long. I don't know why I forgot the title. I kept thinking of the lyrics. It won't be long, which, just like when I get home and others, it won't be long. It was just unlike anything. It's moving around in modes, two different modes. And yet it sounds so conventional. Anyone can
well, I
sing
mean,
it. Won't be long, yeah, yeah, yeah. But
yeah,
everything that's going on in that song is completely original, very sophisticated.
yeah.
And
No,
so
there is a reason why a great many very distinguished composers have not only praised the Beatles, but obviously they're the group whose music is most frequently transcribed by composers of considerable, James McMillan, Toru Takemitsu. It's simply and as you say, to get back to the essential point from which we began, and before we begin to close down, I'm afraid I'm wearing down. I'm afraid the pain is, as you know, a bit exhausting. Hey Jude is a simple ballad form in many ways, and It's there's not really our impression of them moving from almost childlike simplicity to great sophistication is a failure actually to grasp how how revolutionary the structure of their songs were. And I actually, I've never been one of those who prefers one period to another. And of course, they have the great distinction of being the group that, as much as we lamented them breaking up, nonetheless broke up at just the right time. They never produced a second-rate album, no matter what anyone says.
No,
And,
they never did.
and they never produced two albums that sounded the same.
No, no. Well, this is the thing. With the Beatles, you see a constant change, but what you don't see is them going from simple to complex. They were complex right off the start. Well, at the start, right from the gate. I mean,
Off the
their
board.
sophistication of their music is there in early songs, but they moved into things that, George Harrison being willing to be influenced by the music of India.
Well,
And the
I
and I mean that's a totally new cultural influence, and things like that. They kept moving. They kept
I
changing their sound without ever being inauthentic. It was always still very original, very much them. Whether it was
I will point out though that John Lennon, after and starting actually during their flirtation with the Maharishi in India, actually had a tendency towards the pentatonic. Um, and that's why I wanted to emphasize that the pentatonic is still there deep in the ground of the
well,
Indian.
it's actually very deeply there in all the most developed tonality of Bach. There's still a structure where everything else has grown from it. I
Uh,
think it's
but
possible
but
that
but
yeah,
the song that John Lennon wrote at the ashram, uh, which was originally on the road to Rishikesh,
yeah,
which he didn't record as a Beatle, but later recorded as Jealous Guy.
yeah.
And, I can't remember if that's on Imagine or Mind Games or why.
I forget too. It's on one of them. I know on Mind Games you've got Meat City, which is an example of his rhythmic complexity. Just
Yeah.
yeah, that Road to Marrakesh, I'd have loved to hear with the original lyrics.
I mean, it's a pentatonic melody right through.
It's a beautiful melody. Well, again, the range with all of them, they could write the most beautiful, stirring music, and then they could do the hardest rock, like obviously Helter Skelter, or something really bluesy and jazzy, like Day Tripper. Or Paul could then write a gospel song, which is what Let It Be is. It's just black gospel music that with its own with his English touch to it is well,
Well, I mean, one of the things, I mean, to simplify it, is one of the just the way in which a new sound was created almost instinctively, of course, is that these are in many ways very much British folk melodies, both Celtic and English, and set to a rock and roll beat early on. But it's also the thing that, putting all the issues of complexity, structural sophistication, again, apparently just pouring out of them without need of formal training, is simply how is it possible to come up with that many melodies that good in that time? And Paul
The
McCartney,
Mole of Kintyre by Paul McCartney, so Irish.
Paul, Paul McCartney continues to be able just at will to create a memorable melody. Now,
Yes, he still is. He still got it. I mean, his most recent album, which he made solo because he couldn't, everybody was isolated during the pandemic. It was brilliant stuff. I mean, he's 82 now, and so he would have been like 78 at that time. And no, still got it. Still, Paul Simon still has it. I mean, these old guys they've still got it. The Seven Psalms by Paul Simon, he just came out with. These,
well,
these fellows from the 60s are still, well, they're still better than anybody today, just about. Who's
well,
coming on.
I mean,
I mean, a few
I'm
exceptions.
preaching to the choir here. I'm not.
I know what they're thinking. Those old guys, look at them talking about their time, but you know, but
I
these
think
guys.
you'll find sympathetic as well. But yeah, so but yeah, no, I mean, at the end of the day, it's still, I find it staggering that I mean, there are, I mean, groups that are musically very impressive, and I mean, the Who, obviously,
Yeah, they did an album just a few years ago with some new stuff, and it was great,
but
great stuff.
I
Oh,
mean,
I know a really good song. It was by Simon Towns,
yes, I know, but the point I'm
his
making,
younger brother. But yeah,
is that very sophisticated, I mean, extraordinary virtuosity. I mean, people like John Entwistle on the bass, you can't really do much better than that.
Roger Daltrey singing
And Pete Townsend
wow.
is a serious composer in many ways.
He is.
And but at the end of the day, the Beatles are unique probably in that there is no such thing as the Beatles song that everybody recognizes as the Beatles song. I'll put this out. Um, you know, because most groups manage one or two or three really
It,
memorable songs, whether they're good or not, memorable. I mean, if you love Kansas, that means you love Carry On My Wayward Son or Dust in the Wind. That's all that means. Everything else is getting ready for one of those songs. You're waiting to get to that place on the album, or filling in the time afterwards.
oh, this is why Paul McCartney's concerts are 3 hours long, even though he's 82. I don't know
Well,
where he gets the energy. Maybe it's an advertisement for
a lot of
vegetarianism, but I don't
no,
know.
uh, there are a lot of highly respected guys. I mean, Bruce Springsteen, whom I find pretty mediocre, but nonetheless, a lot of people like him. But with the Beatles, I've never met two people who had the same list of their favorite songs, and I can't. And I even the things they didn't like themselves that they considered
Especially John Lennon. He
well
didn't like anything that he did. It's,
everything he
oh, that
did.
was crap. That was crap. In fact, he used the other word for it. It's like, no, it was great. What are you talking about?
Well, we're all critical of our best work, I guess. But the thing,
Well, a true artist is never satisfied.
yes,
You know, so
but
John Lennon talked about one of my favorites, and your bird can sing. He says, "Oh, I wrote that shit." It's like, no, it's brilliant. What are you talking about?
that's a magnificent song. Which
It's and the lyrics and the song, it's wonderful. Anybody else would be the greatest achievement of
those
their lifetime.
who didn't grow up in the age of vinyl in America may not know that on the American release of Revolver, they cut out "And Your Bird Can Sing,"
Yeah,
"Dr. Robert," and "I'm Only Sleeping."
yeah. But they put them on an album called Yesterday and
Yeah,
Today.
right. But I mean, removing those three Lennon songs from Revolver not only gave the impression that this was a McCartney centric album to a degree it wasn't, but also, detracted from what is, to my mind, the most brilliant disc of popular music that was ever cut. I mean, I think
Yeah.
Revolver was.
Well, in Britain, they would have the standard in England was 14 songs on an album, but Capitol Records, being Americans, they wanted to squeeze every penny out. And so Capitol Records, the American division of EMI, put either only 11 or 12 songs on an album.
Yeah, so they could
They
compile.
cut Revolver. They patched together an album called Yesterday and Today, which wonderful collection.
Yeah,
First Beatle album we ever owned. I don't know if you remember that because you were two when we bought it, but
perfect memories of everything that happened when I was two. Yes. Yeah, no, I know, but yeah, no, we
in
all
fact,
agree.
we had a sticker on it, which means we had one of those collector's items with the original cover that they covered with a sticker of the other photograph. We owned one of those, and we didn't know what it was.
Yes, the butcher shot, yes, which was for its
But
time, for its time, quite,
you
quite.
see, Capitol Records, their idea was to squeeze every bit of money out of it they could. Whereas in England, the standard was they wanted to make sure they were being honest and giving the customer, their money's worth.
The last thing I'll
The
say,
Beatles would not take a single
right?
that sold in England, which really is two songs. People don't know. A single was what's called it was a 45 RPM, played faster, had a bigger thing in the middle, so you had to have something you had to stick something in there so it would go around the turntable. Was these little things that you had for those. But the Beatles would not take a single and put it on an album originally
I thought that was
because they thought they were cheating people if they did that.
legal.
And they would not give them less than 14 songs in an album. So, and this is just a very English way, you give the people their money's worth. And in America, the Capitol Records, they put just about everything on both as singles and as albums and squeezed as much. So, they took songs off of. They did the same thing with Rubber Soul.
No, I mean the first Beatles album that actually reached America in an unadulterated, unabridged, unmutilated form was Sergeant Pepper's.
That was, and they couldn't touch it. They had to be done the way the Beatles made it
Mm.
because they insisted on it.
But all I said, the one thing that I regret about the Beatles' scrupulousness in regard to not recycling singles into albums is, of course, those recording sessions that created Revolver, which were the first really extended recording sessions when they weren't touring at the same time, so they could experiment, also produced Rain and Paperback Writer.
Right.
And Rain, one of John Lennon's masterpieces, may, if I had to, on my short list of favorite Beatles songs, it definitely would be on there, might be at the top. And it would, and I especially, I keenly regret that um, Revolver wasn't 16 songs long, because if it had those on it as well, it would be so perfect an album that history might have come to a halt actually at that point. Um,
It was George Harrison's favorite Beatles album, and it's the one that broke the mold.
yeah,
It's the album where the artists took control.
well,
And all the recording studio, what they were going to do in the recording studio pretty much had to go along with them because now they were at the top of the game. They were calling the shots. So if there had not been a Revolver, there would have never been a Sergeant Pepper or Magical Mystery Tour. Uh, that had to come first,
yeah, yeah.
and
and
it changed things dramatically.
yeah, and we're all the better for it. So we've talked now about the Beatles more than we talked about Chopin. So that's
That's because of who our age is. Let's face it, it's the generation, it's the times we came from. Uh, well, Chopin never wrote anything that was influenced by Indian music or any psychedelic pieces. So, what can I say?
that first piano concerto is kind of psychedelic. So.
I don't really hear it myself, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, I say about the Rubber Soul came out and kind of shocked everyone at the time.
Yeah, at the time.
Then the Beach Boys released Pet Sounds, um, which was innovative in as sort of, so kind of answer to it. Then the Beatles came out with Revolver, and that kind of sealed the deal, I think. Who really, but it was an epochal album, and that can be forgotten. But it also just, to my mind, still holds up. As it still sounds new to me after all these years, and it's just nothing better has appeared.
One of the things I did when I did my cover of Rain on my YouTube channel, um, I've come lately to where I used to record everything on one track, like was doing a performance. And then I discovered that not only does it sound better to record wiring it into the computer, but using different tracks to capture different things is a lot more fun. So when I did my cover of Rain, the track that I videoed, because just usually video one of it, is me playing the drums part, but not on the keyboard, because this Yamaha keyboard has drum sets and percussion instruments built into it as well. So
Since
uh,
you since you bring that up, you talked about it's true that by that point they're all writing. I mean, John's writing his songs, Paul's writing his. With the last one they really collaborated on was "We Can Work It Out" in any substantial way, because they had two different songs they put together.
probably, yeah.
And
I mean,
George was writing his songs. But it is true that when it came to recording it, it did become collaborative again. They were all, you know,
oh yeah, oh yeah, the recordings were collaborative, and Ringo was always a major part of that too, just as
Ringo
much as
is underrated. I mean, I regard him as a musical genius. He was
he
musical.
is.
Yeah, he was not.
He is, and he's the oldest rock and roll star still performing.
He was not like he didn't have the. He was not Buddy Rich or Ginger Baker or anything. That's not the point. But
Oh, he don't
his
want a Buddy
musical.
Rich with the
Well,
Beatles.
it would make no sense, and so too Ginger Baker. You wouldn't. I mean, it works for.
Wouldn't even have wanted Keith Moon with the Beatles.
No, again, I mean,
Well,
those are drummers that fit an entirely different side. But the thing about Ringo, of course, is that his musical sensibility that
right.
came up, it's perfect. Every song, it's perfect. It's like,
That,
it's really part of the music. It's not just a backbeat. And Rain, of course, to my mind, is the supreme example of the collaborative nature, because of course it's a great song.
well, they
John
actually
makes
recorded the instrumental part real fast and it
Oh
slowed
yeah,
it.
yeah. No, if you hear the tracks they laid down together for the instrumental part, the drum, bass, and lead guitar, and so they played together,
Do it.
was extremely fast and extremely tight, and then they slowed it down to create that uncanny hymn. But the thing is that song. What makes that song great is not just the song. It is, George came up with this really imaginative guitar line. The bass is incredible because all of
Oh,
Paul McCartney's bass
yeah.
from '66 onward, especially, is brilliant. And the drumming is just beautiful.
And
There's a
absolutely
little
ingenious.
slight syncopation at the beginning of the line, that hesitation that he liked to throw in. And he would joke that said, "Well, I'm left-handed when I'm playing right-handed drums, and that's why it happens." But
And we don't understand that in America, but you'll always hear the Beatles be very modest about some of the most brilliant stuff they did. And it's one of the things you can't help but like about them. It's like, because an American would be bragging about it. Well, no, I did this really great, brilliant thing.
well, there are British braggarts. I think I mentioned Ginger Baker before. I once heard him say, you know, people say that they like John Bonham and Keith Moon. It's like the people are so stupid they don't realize, you know, oh, Mooney couldn't possibly play the things I played. So that's all right. That's
Actually, I knew a woman who met all four of the Beatles, and her capacity as a security manager, I guess you might say, at Madison Square Garden. She met a lot of people. And she tells this story about how when Paul McCartney was doing a concert there once, Ringo was there and he came to see Paul. Now, all of the other big celebrities would just force their way in backstage. If they wanted to come backstage, you would just let it, they didn't even ask, they just would, which was a bit of a problem for the security office. And then she remembers that no, she has to go because Ringo Starr is standing there and he's asking permission to come backstage. And so she said the thing about them is it never went to their heads. From
There was a lot of decency in them too. I mean, you remember like when they're coming to the States for the first time, they're like 24 years old, average at that point, and having their first big tour in the very intimidating world of American music, and they were informed in that press conference that there was like segregated seating in some of the southern venues.
Oh yeah, they wouldn't put up with that.
And it takes them half a second to absorb this, and then you don't treat people like animals. I mean, they were saying, and they manage when they've had to
Their contracts from that point on, no segregated audiences.
Oh, well, they forced. I mean, a lot of venues had to because there was no way they were going to give up the ticket, the gate for the Beatles. So the Beatles, a little known bit of musical history, were one of the great forces in desegregating deep Southern.
That's right.
So anyway, look, I didn't expect us to talk so much about the Beatles, but again, I'm always willing to do so because like you, my taste in music. Well, I also may be a bit idolatrous where Bach is concerned, but I mean, my taste in
If you
music,
talk to me about Bach, we'll spend another 2 hours.
and I'm afraid I no longer have the
Well,
stamina.
he's influenced my compositions. That in
Debated.
fact, I even refer to my fugue in D minor as my Bach fugue because I deliberately wrote it in such a way that I want the great man himself to approve of it.
Yeah, we'll wait for the.
Never heard it. I think he does.
Yeah. So it was good to see you. Good to talk to you. I
My
love.
G minor fugue is my Shostakovich fugue, but that's another subject. Okay. Well, it's good seeing you, and just I am glad to be able to visit you a few 2 weeks ago. So
Yeah, and it's no secret to my readers that I'm in a lot of pain, and I don't know what the future holds.
we're all praying.
Uh, so it's good to see you.
You too.
I love you.
Love you too, son. I mean, brother. You're young.
Son. Okay. Well,
You're so much younger than I am that slipped out. But
you're one of the people in the world who knows me as Ben, the name I had from childhood, and
oh,
so
I taught you how to play baseball
it's true. And
and how to finger a bat to get the most force out.
you were a very fine baseball player, and it was when you began playing the piano and began worrying about your fingers, you gave up the career that could have made us all.
Oh, I don't.
You'd have been a solid doubles in the gap hitter, and you were a great fielder. I mean, you could have made it at least as high as double A. All right. I'm going to stop the recording now.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay. If you can edit the embarrassing parts out, that'll be that'll be good.
That's all right. I'm afraid I can't. Too much work. Okay.